Inside the presidency's weakest hour, every presidency has moments of pressure, but there is a difference between stress and vulnerability. This was the hour when the office itself felt exposed, when power still existed, yet confidence in its ability to hold everything together quietly disappeared. The warning signs didn't come from enemies or opposition. They came from inside the system. Processes slowed, assumptions failed, decisions that once moved effortlessly now stalled under doubt and hesitation. The institutional reflexes that normally carry a presidency through difficulties seemed to have lost their responsiveness, as though the system itself had become uncertain about what it was supposed to do. To understand why this hour was so dangerous, we have to understand how presidential strength really works. It isn't measured only by authority or law. It's measured by momentum, the belief that decisions will carry forward once made. During this moment, that momentum vanished. The president was surrounded by information, but starved of certainty. Advisors disagreed sharply. Each option carried consequences no one could fully predict. Acting too quickly risked exposure. Acting too slowly risked irrelevance. For the first time, the presidency was forced to confront a terrifying possibility. What if the office could no longer compel outcomes? What if power still existed, but effectiveness did not? What if the office could issue commands that were technically valid, yet practically meaningless, because the system receiving those commands had lost confidence in the judgment behind them? This was not a public crisis. The nation saw no collapse, no emergency broadcast, no visible fracture. But inside the Oval Office, leadership was operating on borrowed confidence. The projection of control was deliberate and necessary, but the substance behind it was thinner than anyone outside the room could have known. The gap between appearance and reality had widened to a point where maintaining the appearance itself required enormous effort. The weakest hour of a presidency isn't when opposition is loud, it's when doubt is quiet. And in that silence, every decision feels heavier than the last. Because once power hesitates long enough, it begins to question itself. And that is where this hour begins. Not with external crisis, but with an internal reckoning that the office's own confidence had become its greatest vulnerability. As the hour unfolded, the presidency relied less on authority and more on calculation. Every move was weighed not just for impact, but for perception. Would this restore confidence, or expose how fragile control had become? Inside the White House, discussions grew circular. Advisors debated not what should be done, but what could be done without triggering resistance. The space for decisive action narrowed with every exchange. This is how weakness manifests at the highest level of power, not through incompetence, but through over-awareness. Every option carries risk. Every risk carries consequence. And consequence now felt unmanageable. The president still held the office. The symbols of power remained. But symbols alone don't move systems. They require belief. And belief was eroding faster than authority could compensate. External actors sensed the hesitation. Allies waited for clarity. Opponents tested boundaries. Institutions delayed, protecting themselves against uncertainty. No one wanted to commit first. The presidency found itself reacting to the system it was meant to lead. That reversal is subtle and devastating. When leadership finds itself responding to the system rather than directing it, the fundamental relationship between the presidency and the institutions it governs has inverted. The office is still present, but its function has changed from driver to passenger. Because leadership loses its edge not when it lacks options, but when it lacks confidence in its own ability to execute them. The weakest hour isn't marked by failure. It's marked by restraint driven by fear. And fear, once introduced into decision-making at this level, reshapes everything that follows. As fear settled in, the presidency began to shrink its ambitions. Not publicly, not deliberately, but instinctively. Decisions became smaller, language more cautious, commitments more conditional. This is how power contracts without surrendering. The ambitions narrow, the scope of action shrinks. The presidency pulls back from the edges of its authority, not because it's been pushed, but because it no longer trusts the ground beneath its feet. Every action becomes a test of whether the system will still respond, and the fear of discovering it will not is enough to prevent the test from being conducted. Inside the Oval Office, leaders searched for certainty where none existed. Data conflicted. projections shifted. Every plan depended on cooperation that could no longer be guaranteed. The presidency was no longer shaping outcomes. It was managing exposure. What made this hour uniquely dangerous was the feedback loop it created. The more cautiously power was used, the less effective it appeared. The less effective it appeared, the more caution felt necessary. Momentum drained away with every careful step, and each step made the next one harder because the baseline of expectation had dropped further. Institutions adapted quickly. Agencies hedged. Partners delayed alignment. External actors filled the vacuum with their own interpretations, not because they wanted to challenge the presidency, but because uncertainty demanded self-preservation. The office still spoke, but the system no longer leaned in. This is the hidden moment when leadership becomes fragile, not because authority disappears, but because confidence does. And once confidence is gone, even correct decisions feel risky. By the end of the hour, nothing dramatic had happened. No collapse, no rebellion, no visible failure. But something essential had shifted. The presidency no longer trusted itself to move decisively, and that realization would shape every decision that followed. When the weakest hour passed, it left no record, no memo, no admission. The public never knew how close the presidency came to losing its confidence entirely. But internally, the impact was lasting. From that point forward, leadership became more guarded. Decisions were structured to avoid exposure. Authority was exercised selectively, where success felt assured. Risk was managed rather than confronted. The presidency had internalized a lesson of its weakest hour, and that lesson reshaped its behavior in ways that were invisible to the public, but fundamental to how power was actually exercised. The office survived, but it emerged changed. This is the unseen cost of vulnerability at the highest level. Once power recognizes its own fragility, it never operates the same way again. Every future decision carries the memory of hesitation. History often looks for moments of failure or triumph. It rarely examines moments of doubt. Yet doubt shapes leadership as deeply as defeat. The presidency that has experienced its own fragility carries that knowledge forward into every subsequent decision. And that knowledge inevitably makes leadership more conservative, more cautious, and more acutely aware of the gap between authority and effectiveness. The weakest hour didn't destroy the presidency. It taught it caution. Whether that lesson preserves stability or undermines strength depends on what followed. But one truth remains. Power that hesitates learns restraint, even when boldness might be needed. And restraint, once learned in fear, is difficult to unlearn. It embeds itself into the institutional memory of the office, shaping how future decisions are approached and how future risks are evaluated, long after the original moment of vulnerability has passed. Subscribe to join the journey. In